Hi, good evening, everybody. Just thinking of some of my friends and dear community members, beloved community members, some of our uh, St. Paul, Minneapolis folk that are out there, Bethel University folk, some people from Sanctuary Covenant, place of our living and creating many memories. Been following some of the news online and just considering, what people are going on and or going through at this time. Uh, but yeah, let me humbly submit, um, beginning with home because it's safer. We all would love to see non-violent change, non-violent revolution. And I'm a child of the 70s, so I kind of missed some of the more outrageous, if you like, pieces of the violent revolution that took place, like the 1976 uprisings. But sometimes one has to consider, in a global atmosphere, well, how do you how do you consider, people's anger, people's pain, people's shame. And I want to be clear that as a person who works on issues of social justice, race, and reconciliation, I would always seek to choose a way that's reconciliation focused, if I may say. But one has to consider how long will people live like this? Not just in the United States of America, but globally. How long will bodies that are aesthetically endowed outside whiteness, bodies that are socially constructed and brought into a world where they grow up in the margins, a marginalized economy, a marginalized racial identity, a marginalized class identity, a marginalized gender identity. And today I had a chance to speak to one of my friends who's actually in Minneapolis right now. And while it was here round about 11 a.m., she was wide awake, concerned in the early parts of the mornings of the activities that would be going on. Um, but yeah, this is the world we are living in when we consider and have to seriously think through, well, what do these bodies that are embodied in blackness, these bodies that are embodied in femaleness, how long will people be captured and raptured in a substandard existence? And something's got to give. Something's got to wake up in the system. Systemic people need to stop talking smart. I mean, I wrote a reflection. Those of you that are watching, it's good to have some of my friends here. Jacqueline Kumar is actually one of my friends in St. Paul, Minneapolis right now. Benita's here, Stanley Simon. Some of these folk are all interested in work around issues of reconciliation, justice, and so on. And in my experience of having done some of this work, I have to say that it can become quite conflicting, quite irritating to one's brain, to one's common senses. I really do believe that I've tried to live my life focused on issues of reconciliation. I'm now well past the age of 40, but I've been around reconciliation kind of work for about 20 years. I started out on diversity teams, and in my experience, I was able to travel through my work and with my work around the world. But I mean, people that are that are embodied in marginalized identities are suffering. And we can't just throw quick fixes at these issues. But we do need boldness. We do need courage from people to fix systemic injustices. I was wondering, how does one then begin to think upon, courageous speaking, courageous mobilization, courageous activism? There are some people more that are close to me who know the pain that I have felt. Now, I have lived in the States, I've worked in Germany, I've worked in England, and obviously, being a South African, I'm from South Africa. But racism can make you go crazy. And if you are a body that is embodied in identities that leave you in the margins, can you imagine? Let me tell, not now to I can't really speak about being an African American because I am a child of African Indian heritage, but born in South Africa. However, as a person who would be a person, identified as a person who's not white in the global hemisphere, we have to start checking into the systemic injustices that plague our world. And I wrote a piece where I said, if you're going to be out there and you are a spokesperson, a teacher, a keynote speaker, a consultant, because there's a lot of us out there doing CQ trainings, EQ trainings, emotional intelligence trainings, CQ trainings, cultural intelligence trainings, the racism workshops, anti-racism workshops, gender bias workshops. People are talking about, unconscious bias workshops. I mean, but someone has to seriously say, but for how long? How long can people continue living like this when you construct them as people as back against the wall kind of people, and they are forever in the margins? I mean, can you imagine the fatigue, the emotional fatigue, the psychological fatigue that are placed on people that are of darker hue, that are of female gender? Can you imagine? And yes, it might sound crazy. How can you start looting and burning and kicking and screaming? But I, here in the South African landscape, who grew up after the 1976 eras, find myself at times very, very agitated. Some folk even might find me so agitated so that they may not want to be, but I'm grateful for some partners and community members and places that have said, no, listen, that guy's on edge, but his heart is in the right place. Because otherwise, they lock you out. You'll be locked out of an economy. You're locked out of earnings. You're locked out of resources to take care of your family and your loved ones because you're trying to be courageous to beat the system. And what do we require? Well, in the work I've done, and my work has crossed over now in corporate spaces, in educational spaces, over 20 years, I've had the honor to work in the length and breadth of organizational design. And I can say to you that it does take us to have people who have influence and power to start to wake up to the realities that where change can become significant. So if I'm talking in my own family, if I talk in a microcosm around issues of gender injustice, I have a family that are largely would be identified as African Indian South Africans. But over 10 years, we have begun to deconstruct the gender bias in our family. We have begun to deconstruct issues of behavior, like where men would just come in, not wash dishes. Now, remember, I'm not talking about race right now. I'm talking about gender inequality in our society. But over 10 years, consistently doing this work in our little microcosm. This is largely between two families, my wife's family, my family that I grew up in. Over 10 years, it can change. But can you imagine how much work has to be done in the global system, in the corporate system, when we talk about issues of at least, like Howard Thurman would suggest to us, at least think of 3 variables: race, class, and gender. So earlier this week I said, if you're out there and you've got influence, or you're speaking, or you're managing, start to look at the world that is socially constructed for us and how you can become an advocate who will use your voice, who will use your resources, who will use your intelligence to deconstruct these systems that are structured for injustice, to deconstruct systems that will deframe and maim and break down humankind, that are of a racial identity that is other than whiteness, or an ethnic identity that is other than upper classness. And we need to wrestle with this. Someone asked me a question some time ago and said, well, how have you navigated? I said, well, education has helped me. Education has definitely helped me, because the reality is, when you look at the intersectionality between race, class, gender, and many other variables could be added onto the table. Okay? But I always come back again to a microcosm, and I said to some of my friends, I have cousins who come out of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, in a place called Unit 2. We both come out of the same lineage, same heritage. However, the significant differences are of our growing up, our exposure, and so on and so forth. And so I could be navigating life where people might say, hey man, that guy is more palatable. Well, I've sought not to be palatable to systemic injustice. I've sought not to be palatable to racism, subtle racism, and overt racism. But to succeed, friends, you need to understand that people have to work continuously against the system that really fatigues you. It makes you crazy. Now, I'm grateful that in my family I've got somebody like my dear partner and my wife Marisha, who understands psychology, who understands the health of my mind, that I need to keep my mind intact. But if I tell you, like for example, friends that have passed on too early, they've passed on too early because of the pain and the difficulty that they faced. Even right now, I might look at some generations that are aging to the, good old age of 90s and 100s. But in my family cycle, I've seen people pass away around about 60. This is in South Africa. When I cross over in the global situation and I think about the States, I mean, how do people who identify as black, and those that are black and brown people in that society, how do they navigate in a world where, even when you are so passive, you don't have the assertiveness you don't know what courage looks like anymore. You've been taught things like acronyms like DWB. I remember when I stayed in the States, one of my friends took me through a little conversation exercise. Said, Seth, if you're going to be driving around in St. Paul, in Minneapolis, you need to know about DWB. I said, what's that? He said, AKA driving while black. Can you imagine needing to teach your child how to understand that when they stopped by a policeman, immediately they are already configured and stereotyped and positioned toward danger and postured toward danger? Now, I know how that feels, because we've had our own situations here in South Africa. I remember growing up as a young child, when white police officers would stop my dad and treat him like he was nothing, yet he's got his wife, and at that time it was just myself and my brother. Cross it over. I mean, I was in the States when Youth for Christ had sent me over. I was about 19 years old, and I didn't know. In our cultural context here in South Africa, when the policeman stops you, well, you just get up. I'll walk out my car and, go and greet the policeman, possibly have a conversation. That's how I grew up. Now, this is not to say this was not the 1970s of the story that I just told you when my dad was stopped. So things started to change when I was here in SA. Even now, though, when we stop, people would have a conversation. In the States, I didn't know. I landed there in I think around the time 1998, and I was driving a Ford van, but had a hoodie on, some music blasting, and had 4 friends in. The police stopped us, and for some reason, somebody didn't tell me about the fact that when the police stop you, you don't jump out the vehicle. I jumped out the vehicle in Minneapolis, and there, lo and behold, cops getting out. You can think to yourself, guns were already drawn, and telling me, and in vulgar language, to get down on the floor. I mean, fortunately, I got down, and then they said, get back in the car, and I got back into the vehicle. Well, that was a hard way to learn about the States in that way. But when I look at what's been happening in the United States of America, it's really disheartening. It's disheartening to the soul to think of that kind of a developed country. Well, to me, we must reconfigure even there. What does that mean politically, developed country? What does it mean to people that are living, with their backs against the wall? That just to be, a black man in America means you living in fear. A black woman in America, you living in fear all the time. How do you live like this? And then what can we do about it? Well, people that are out there, I've already watched some stuff going on Facebook. People are complaining. Please have an understanding that the complexity of people's pain is going to become irregular. There will be a villainous approach. But if you're a clergy person, if you're friends in the community, go out with more community members. Get more people onto the streets. Start marching with people. If you clergy out there, if you are imams out there, if you are people that are religious workers in different faiths, get out onto the streets with the people, talk to the people, make the space a space that seems, if I can say charged, that the atmosphere is charged. Hopefully it doesn't need to turn violent. But it's already turned violent, and why? Because people are so angry, and there isn't any leadership to be out there with them. Now we've seen some leaders, making speeches, and I don't want to disregard them at all. But for those people who care for the city and who are busy sitting on Facebook and Facebooking and sending messages, well, it may require that in St. Paul, Minneapolis, some of our presidents of universities, our CEOs of companies, our folk that are in the cities that are people of influence, people of power, to get out onto the streets with folk and kind of, start thinking, what can we do together? What can we do together to deconstruct these issues of racism and violence against people that are embodied in black bodies? So as I say this tonight, I don't think I'm angry. Well, I'm concerned. I'm too far from the action in the United States of America to be fired up with, that kind of anger. But I am emotional to think upon the fact that some of my friends, some of the people that I love and care for, will be facing these irregularities even now in such a time as this. So, yeah, I figure I'm just kind of sharing with people that we need to become a little bit more sharp about our critique, our analysis of what's happening in a racial hemisphere. So I think while I've shared those thoughts, what do I see as things that works in the global atmosphere? Well, one has to know how to posture themselves and position themselves with power. Now I tell a crazy story, but it happened to me here in South Africa. I was pulled off by South African police on my way to church on a Sunday morning with my family in the car. And this is now in a post-apartheid era, so I can't tell you that it was a race issue. Well, but I mean, race is complex, isn't it? And class is complex, isn't it? But a policeman stopped me. I was heading to Lens South from an area called Alberton, and they irregularly stopped me. And then instead of allowing me to speak or whatever, they said no, speeding. And this guy switched off my vehicle, reached through, the policeman did, and then took my keys. In this blaze of events, I kind of lost my mind. Got out my vehicle while 3 of my children were in the car with my wife and started darting after this policeman, only to run obviously into the rest of his crew. But by that time, I'd lost my if I can say, my scruples, and I started saying, "Hey, I want my keys back. I want my keys back." And these other policemen, they came at me and they said, "What are you up to?" I said, "I have my rights. I know my rights. I want my keys. Why did this guy take my keys?" Well, the funny end of the story was, in the heat of that moment, I was actually supposed to be at a Sunday morning service to be preaching at Yeshua Community Church. So the people from the church were calling, and here we were stuck in this traffic block, if I can say, by a policeman that pulled us over. And fortunately I got away with my keys. They gave me a big ticket and a fine. I wasn't locked up. But I can't imagine anyone in the United States of America ever trying to do that and get away with it. Every story I've heard, when I spoke about the acronym DWB, driving while black, people know that if the police stop you, that you're going to have to really pacify and really bring your emotions down and really be, in a way, nobody. Don't even try to be a smart somebody. Don't try and act like you're assertive. Or don't even try to act like you got a brain. Just take what they tell you, in a way. But I mean, that's already, can you imagine you kind of living in this way you're living like a slave in a modern society. You're living slaved in your emotions, you're living enslaved in in the way you think. So I mean, there's many other folk who can talk about these racial injustices around the world. But as I think upon it, we are needing people to get out and start to change the atmosphere so that people are not judging people based on race. When I say people, I'm talking about people that are otherwise described as white people in a system, law enforcement people who have power. Um, Interestingly, while we watch George Floyd taking place in South Africa, we have the military here going out into townships in South Africa, even in a time like this, COVID-19, and treating some of our people in townships, which are largely black African people, irregularly. Basically, just loading violence on black bodies in townships irregularly, illegally. And this is the military out there. People that are supposed to protect us, take care of us. But who is this being lorded over? In a South African context, it's being lorded over the most marginalized people in the most struggling kind of economies, in a space and place where their home situations are quite tough. The entire environment is filled with economic pain and shame, if I may say that. Now I don't wanna shame people, but there are those that are the haves and those that are the have-nots, and I'm talking simple economics now. However, we find our military that if anyone has been affected, even in this time on COVID-19, an irregularity of police, military police entering into an atmosphere, it's been by and large in our South African terms in townships. Now, if we think about America and we think about what's happening there, well, it wouldn't surprise me that we'll see a lot more police presence in places where people who are not white are moving and existing. So tonight, as I'm reflecting again, I think I'm calling on people that are in the space of advocacy, in the space of preaching and teaching and keynoting, to please use a contextual approach to how we put forward what we are saying, and at least consider three variables: race, class, and gender. This kind of learning is brought to me by the teachings of our reflection on Howard Thurman in our focus on reconciliation and justice. So if I'm out there and I'm looking at an atmosphere, whether it be a church or police station or boardroom, I'm looking out for the diversity is there, and then which bodies are present and which bodies are not, which bodies have rights and which bodies are maimed and shamed. And those of us that have the ability to advocate with courage, without danger coming upon us, upon our lives, upon our economy, upon our emotions, then let's use our agency to help others who have less than. For my friends in St. Paul and Minneapolis, I want to say our prayers with you. We are praying for you all and considering you from very, very far away. Some of you may say, I see Brock Byton there. How's it, Brock? Hope that you're well, brother. Much love, grace, and peace to you and your family. But yeah, this is a personal kind of connection because we have great memories in St. Paul, Minneapolis. Our daughter was obviously born there. So I do have an American citizen in my home. And it does concern us that the United States of America seems to be getting this wrong over and over again. We get it wrong in the way we treat people of color. We get it wrong in the way that we judge people who are not white, and further marginalize them, and then just kind of come up with simple answers to complex situations, religious simple answers, judgmental simple answers. So I'm calling out to those of you that have influence, those of you that are socially critically thinking sharp. Obviously, we all want to make sure that villainous elements are not taking over our towns and our cities. But even this week, talking in my own practice, where I work in the church community in Southside Johannesburg, Sometimes I got to go into the middle of spaces where there are gangsters, there's drugs, there's you name it. But it does take me, it takes my mind, my body to walk into that atmosphere and understand how do I position myself. Now, I'm not saying this is for everybody, and I'm not saying that I'm a superstar because I'm doing that. It's my work, but I've had to contend with that. I've had to contend with the fact that if I'm going to stand up for justice, sometimes there comes a cost. And for me, in a South African context, it has meant that I need to leave my middle class comforts and go to the place and pain of those that are suffering. And if I'm known enough in that atmosphere, then by God's grace, hopefully I'll come away with my life as well. And I'm not saying that this should be the issue, but there has to be some people in the here and now, if I can use this Esther kind of terminology, that will say, for such a time as this, who will be the ones that will stand up with those that are the marginalized, and actually use your voice, use your reason, use your education, use your resources to get behind people who are marginalized, who are treated as nobody in a world of global and systemic justice. And in the United States of America, where black bodies are just considered as nothing. We need theologians. We need, economists. We need business owners. We need CEOs who have power and influence to use it for the sake of people who don't. So, tonight, thank you for those that popped in. I just decided to add some voicing to what I'm watching on news, and also what I'm also considering here in South Africa. I do pray that some kind of peace will be resolved, or there'll be some resolutions in the city of St. Paul and Minneapolis. But more especially, I am hoping that there will be a deeper, lasting change. There will be a deconstruction of racial inequality, of gender inequality, and that black bodies in America will not be so endangered any longer. And I know that there are some good people. One of the good people I know is busy watching right now, Carla Dow. I've had the experience of being in one or two of her classes while Marisha was studying with her. There are good people out there that can actually use their resources to pursue such lasting change. So hope that you all are well. Please be safe, and do what you can to make some change, positive change in our global atmosphere around issues of injustice. My closing text is something that lingers with me and will always be. It's also by way of us serving at Via Christi Community Church. It's the golden text of their mission and vision as a church. But when I finished off at Bethel University and I was called to speak, I think in one of those graduation ceremonies, I quoted from Micah, from the prophet Micah 6:8. And we are reminded today, the Lord, we know what the Lord has required of us: to act justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with God. I'm really trusting God for the safety of my friends, that are people that are living in St. Paul and Minneapolis, and also my friends that are embodied in darker hues, that they would find grace and mercy. And for my friends who are known and identify as whites in St. Paul and Minneapolis, I'm trusting that you will find your voice to assist people to think through this, especially those that some of the communities that I've been a part of. You are some of the best thinkers that I've met in around the world, and not just the best thinkers, the best actors for justice. So I'm hoping that more people can come around folk in that space. And even here in South Africa, if you are one who has rational reason and thinking to interrupt systems of injustice, use your influence for the good of all. And more especially for those who are living with their backs against the wall. Don't leave people, just by the wayside. Thank you. God bless. It's almost it's a late part of our evening now. I need to take some time to rest, but I pray for rest and peace with our people that are facing tough times, in more especially St. Paul and Minneapolis, and even in different parts of South Africa and around the world. Take care and God bless.